you so much for having me, Langston. I'm a staff writer at The Atlantic in the ideas section, which is our opinion section. I'm originally from Washington, D.C. That's where I grew up mostly. I started off, when I started off as a journalist, I really wanted to be a documentary filmmaker, but this is going to date me. I had a blog, it was around 2008, where you could do that. I had a blog where I would write about race and politics and stuff like that. And I was at journalism school learning how to do video stuff. But there's a small liberal magazine in Washington, D.C. called The American Prospect that reached out to me and were like, hey, would you like to blog for us? And at the time, I was blogging under a pseudonym because that was a thing people did then. And, but they said you'd have to use your real name. And this was around 2009. I did, and they asked me to apply for their fellowship, which was their entry-level position. And it worked out. I started off there, and so I really didn't end up doing what I went to journalism school for, which was making documentaries. It was still a good experience, though. I mean, New York is one of those cities where I'm not sure you could do this any place else because of the availability of public transportation. But they basically said, you got to pick a beat, you got to pick a neighborhood, and you got to write about everything that something that has the stories that you write have to come from this neighborhood. So I took the train to Utica Avenue, and I was trying to go to Crown Heights, but I ended up in Bed-Stuy. So I was covering Bed-Stuy as a journalism student. It was a very valuable experience for me because I wasn't one of those people who, had written for the school newspaper, had always known I wanted to be a journalist, nothing like that. In fact, prior to getting into journalism school, I was actually, I had a series of, I majored in English, so I didn't have a lucrative job after college. And I was working at this place that made books on tape for the blind and handicapped for the Library of Congress. So it was a thing where they'd have a voice actor in a booth and they'd read the book, and I'd have to record and then stop. And I was very bad at it because it was often very boring, and I would fall asleep, and I was spending all my waking hours playing World of Warcraft because I was miserable. But I sort of weaned myself off of that by blogging. That was sort of my way of finding something else to do with my time, because I wanted to do something that felt valuable, or that felt like I was actually accomplishing something instead of wasting all my time doing that. It eventually led to journalism school, which led to the American Prospect. And at the time, the journalism industry was really looking for people who could write with a voice. And I think that's why I've always been attracted to magazine journalism. For the most part, I've worked for either magazines or for websites that were looking for a magazine type voice. And one of the big tragedies of journalism is you see the decline of alt weeklies, because alt weeklies were sort of magazine-esque papers that really they train reporters to write and report, but but also to use voice in writing, which I think is important. Sometimes there's a little too much emphasis on voice and not enough emphasis on the sort of fundamentals of reporting. But I think what's great about all weeklies and magazines is that they encourage and develop both. You're not just trying to write AP copy that is structured the same way each time. And I was at the American Prospect for a while. I went to Mother Jones, which is another left-wing magazine, but it has a very investigative focus. And while I was there, MSNBC was trying to put together this was back when MSNBC was sort of more overtly liberal in the Obama era. And they were trying to put together a team that could be sort of left-leaning, but was doing actual journalism as opposed to just commentary. And so I was part of that for a while. And then I went to BuzzFeed. BuzzFeed was publishing these incredible sort of feature-length stories, and they had an in-house features desk. And I was an editor on their national desk. So I spent a couple years as an editor rather than a writer. Was actually quite valuable for me as a writer, just to sort of learn from the other side of things. After I was there for a while, I went to the Atlantic sort of towards the end of 2016, which I feel like was a good place to be at that particular time. Obviously the country was still trying very hard to make sense of Donald Trump. And for me, in particular, I felt as though there was really sort of a general denial in the media coverage about what Donald Trump was, what he stood for, what he was doing, and where he came from. There was also this sort of denial that he was what he looked like he was, but also a kind of denial that he was a logical product of American history. Right. There was a sort of desire to see him as an aberration rather than a continuation. And for me, I don't know how many of you have read W.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, which for me is just an incredibly important book. It was written obviously at a time when the general elite historical consensus on Reconstruction was that it had been a mistake. It was a mistake to enfranchise Black men. It was a return to the natural order of things when the former Confederates reimposed white supremacy in the southern states. When he writes about, and this is sort of an epic story of Reconstruction, and he says something in there, which is basically, if you do not believe that the Negro is a man, then I am not writing for you. I'm not trying to convince you. I'm writing history as it happened. Of course, at the time, he was seen as an ideologue, but as time went on and, historians, the general historical consensus shifted, it became the case that Du Bois's history of Reconstruction was seen as far more accurate than the elite consensus during the period in which he was writing, because he chose to write the story as though Black people were human beings. And to me, when I was watching the Trump era, I really felt, because power has a way of justifying itself, because the rest of the media would feel this temptation to justify power. So I was not trying to convince anybody. I was not entering this project of trying to write the sort of first draft of history of the Trump era as best I could. I was not trying to do that with an eye towards convincing Trump supporters, which I think this is a thing that people really, for me, that wasn't the job, right? The job is to tell the truth as a journalist. It's to write down what's really happening. It's not to win people over to my side. It's good to address, to anticipate arguments or objections, but that's different from saying, I'm just trying to convince, I'll say whatever I can to convince you that I'm right. So for the past 5 years or so, I've been sort of working on creating what I felt was the clearest archive I could of what happened during the Trump era and why, from my perspective. Now, obviously, I'm an opinion journalist. It's my opinion. People are going to come to it through that lens. But I felt like it was important because of all the factors that would encourage the media to rationalize what they were seeing in front of their faces. And you saw that in 2015, and you saw it, throughout most of the Trump administration. Something would happen, and there would be this kind of fog of war that would set in, where Trump defenders would say, oh, that thing that he just did, he didn't really do that, or he didn't really mean it that way, or that wasn't what happened. You could see it with the Capitol riot that happened on January 6th as a sort of effort to say it wasn't as bad as it looked. These people weren't violent, they were just tourists, but also Antifa and Black Lives Matter did it. The sort of attempt to sort of muddy the water so that no factual consensus about reality can be formed. And so the book that I just wrote, The Cruelty is the Point, is an essay collection. That's sort of my attempt to set down that factual record as best that I could, in anticipation of the fact that people would try to muddy the water. And obviously, Trump was beaten in 2020, but I'm not entirely sure we're really out of that era. I mean, when you look at the politics of right now, the book takes its title from a piece I wrote called The Cruelty is the Point, which, obviously cruelty is an individual human problem. Like, anybody's capable of cruelty. It's not necessarily a political thing. It's part of human nature. But the book is focused on how it works in politics, specifically the way that it's used to demonize certain groups, so you can justify denying people their basic rights under the Constitution or exclude them from the political process. This is something that Trump obviously did not invent. It's something that, it has a long tradition in American history. And our system actually incentivizes it because, it allows one party to hold power without winning a majority of the votes because of malapportionment in the Senate, gerrymandering in the House, the Electoral College. It's, if you are representing that ideally geographically distributed coalition of very conservative white voters, it becomes even more important to sort of persuade them that they're on the verge of destruction, so that anything they do to prevent that destruction is justified. That's how you end up with, I think, Trump-style politics, which is a sort of paranoia. These people want to destroy you, so you can do anything you want to them. And so, obviously Trump highlighted the role of this kind of politicized cruelty in American politics. But I think it's, as I write in the book, it's a false sense of comfort to think that it's all behind us, and a misinterpretation to think that it's something that he came up with. It's something that, I think goes back to the origins of the United States, where, you say you're creating a country on the basis that all men are created equal. But then you say, well, actually some men are property. And you have to figure out a way to justify that to yourself. You say, well, these people aren't really human beings, so they're not really men, so they don't count when we say all men are created equal. And once you start there, I mean, that is, you can trace that streak of gristle, from the founding of the country to the present, I think.
I love the way that you took us from your beginnings as a journalist all the way through to you now writing the book. And for the audience, for the listeners, I want to talk about this really quickly. Adam and I were speaking about that this book is almost like his mixtape. And sometimes like we know, like when 50 Cent was like at his peak, right? More so than Get Rich or Die Trying, the mixtapes that he would release were some of the best, albums, songs that he produced. And I think having Adam here today is significant because we don't always get someone like Adam when the mixtape drops. So Adam writes for The Atlantic. It's a prominent news magazine. It's been around since the early 1900s, maybe late 1800s.
It was founded prior to the Civil War as an anti-slavery publication. We endorsed Lincoln, believe it or not.
Wow.
Which is good and bad. I mean, I can show the takes from 1865 are pretty good, but the ones from like 1900, not so good.
And I want to say that this is a treat because I want y'all to get to know who he is early. And that's why I asked that question about him telling his story. Because when he's like winning his MacArthur Genius Grant and all that stuff in 5 years, and the broader Black community finally figures out who he is, I want y'all to be like, oh, I was on that Zoom call with him 5 years ago. Also, just talking about the theme of the cruelty, that's the prominent word throughout the book. It's on the title, it's on the chapters. But if there was another word I would use, or a theme I would use throughout the book, it would be mythology. Because I think what you do in a lot of ways throughout the book is debunk what we think is the truth or how we conceive the truth. So could you talk a little bit about how you use this concept of mythology to make connections between Donald Trump and Robert E. Lee and some of the other figures and historical tropes that we see in American history?
Also, I just want to say thank you, Langston. That's very kind of you to say. I think the book is focused on mythology in part because Donald Trump felt like a shattering of some people's conceptions of how America works. And for a lot of people, for a lot of white Americans, Donald Trump getting elected after America elects the first Black president is kind of shocking.
Yeah.
Like how is this the same country? And I think for a lot of Black Americans, it was really not shocking at all because this cycle of progress and backlash is so ingrained in Black American history. And so, I think, one of the there's a way that politicians appeal to American mythology in order to make American voters feel good about voting for them. You know what I mean? And I think Barack Obama in particular had this sort of narrative of American history as like a constant arc of progress. You say the arc of history bends towards justice, but that is actually a lot more complicated than that. Yeah. So you have this sort of liberal narrative that says progress is a straight line. And you have this conservative narrative that says, actually, we were perfect from the beginning. There are no flaws. America is divinely inspired. There's no need to reconsider, the ethics of the founding fathers or who they were, in light of what we now know about them, whether it's Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, or, a figure like Robert E. Lee, who has a prominent place in American cultural mythology that, as I write in the book, he truly does not deserve. And I think when you look at a lot of the conflicts that we're having right now, that are political conflicts, they express themselves as conflicts over history in part because, your understanding of history shapes whether you think the present is just. If you do not, if it is your political objective to say that present hierarchies are natural, enduring, and don't need to be challenged morally, then you don't want a reevaluation of history that might suggest otherwise. And so like you see here in Texas, and there's a particular focus on Texan history here in Texas, which is interesting because obviously, Texans are very proud of their history. but there's a popular conception of Texas history that is at odds with the actual origins of Texas. I mean, I don't know how many of y'all know about this, but there's a book that came out recently called Forget the Alamo. The title is ironic, but what they actually want you to do is to forget the myth of the Alamo and remember the real Alamo. Yeah. And the book is substantially about Texas's origins in, a slave cotton economy and the importance of that to both Anglo-American migration and eventual separation from Mexico. And these, to conceive of, and so there's a reason that Texas reacted so aggressively when you see these states that are trying to do things like ban discussion of racism or, the 1619 Project and stuff like that. That people are reacting to their national myths being challenged because they don't want to reconsider them, because that would force them to reconsider the present. And that's, when we have these arguments about history, this is sort of really what we're arguing about, which is, why does racial inequality exist? And not just racial, but also economic inequality. Why do these things exist? And should we do something about it? And, if you are attached to a myth of American innocence, you probably think we shouldn't do anything about it because everything's fine. Because, any reason for any inequality, is morally acceptable because, America is a free country and always has been, and there's no need to reconsider social or economic hierarchies that might have put certain people in particular positions, or why. And so I think, this is why I focus on myth in the book, but I also think it's why we're having a larger conversation about myths. And to some extent, it's difficult to have a country without some myths, myths that allow you to feel good, because the construction of states is always a violent endeavor. But, I think the ones about America and race are particularly combustible precisely because we've had because of this long history of racial exploitation that people do not want to examine.
There's one point in the book where you're talking about the founding fathers and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Mm-hmm. And the way that I think most people talk about it or think about it is that the founding fathers, who were slave owners, must have been feeling some tension or some internal contradiction when they were writing the Bill of Rights in the original version of the Constitution. And there's a phrase in there, I can't remember exactly what it is, but you say that, like, or at least I got the impression that you were saying that they didn't have any, that maybe they didn't have any conflict because they just didn't think Black people were people. So
I think they did. I think they actually did have conflict.
Okay.
And you can actually see this. Thomas Jefferson, who obviously, owned slaves, he had children with a woman who was legally his property, who was like 14 years old at the time. Mm. If there's this big speech by John Hope Franklin, the legendary historian, and he talks about how Thomas Jefferson, he knew slavery was evil, and when he tried to do something interesting in the Declaration of Independence, which is he tried to get an anti-slavery clause in there, but the way because he knew that the Southern states their economies were dependent on slavery, he tried to blame the Crown for it. He thought politically it would work to blame the British Crown for the slave trade, because then he wouldn't be condemning the Southerners who were, signing on to the Declaration of Independence. So it wasn't that they didn't know, it was that they they created an ideological conviction that allowed them to ignore the contradictions in their stated values and, what they were actually doing. I mean, there's like a famous line from I believe it's a British critic, I'm blanking on the name at the moment, where he says, why is it that we hear the most about freedom from the drivers of Negroes, which was a reference to, the fact that the American colonists kept talking about being slaves to Britain, but they actually owned literal slaves. The only slavery that they felt was morally justified was actual literal slavery. It was only figurative slavery that they found offensive.
Yeah.
So I think the way James Baldwin put it is that the founding fathers had a problem, which is that they knew what a man was. They knew a man when they saw him, and so they had to invent this distinction, which was an ideological one, in order to justify arranging a country around freedom under, that was led by men who own people's property.
The book talks about race from a Black perspective, I think, but then it also talks about discrimination from a Jewish perspective. And I'm wondering if you could talk about how, like, you see yourself and your identity in this work, in the mixtape that you wrote.
So, my mother is African American, and my father is Jewish American, and I was just raised as both. You know what I mean? I think that there was my parents did not raise me with a sense that there was anything contradictory about that. Obviously, I'm very light skinned. I grew up in Washington, D.C. and some other places. My father was stationed in Italy for a few years. So I had to deal with, various people who are hostile to various aspects of my identity at different points in my life. But I just think I was just always raised not to think of those things as a contradiction. In fact, I have family in Georgia who actually converted, I have Black members of my family who actually converted to Judaism. And so, that was always very helpful in dealing with any discomfort I might have about sort of trying to figure myself out. But I think the main thing was that I grew up mostly in Washington, D.C. with a large Black family who loved me and made me feel at home. And so I never really felt, I had times of discomfort. I had, times when people hurt my feelings, or, I had to deal with things that, maybe someone else wouldn't have had to deal with. But, it's always just been I've always seen the world through both of those lenses, through my particular experience. And so, it wasn't, what I try to do when I write is I try not to make it about me. So I try to be honest about my perspective. And that was part of, including that in the book was so that people would understand where I'm coming from. I like to make sure that my readers understand why I feel the way I feel about particular things. But what I don't want to do is make it about that particular part of my biography, because I actually don't think it's all that interesting. There have been people like me forever.
Yeah.
There's when you talk about, there are slave narratives about people like me. I don't know if you know about the Crafts. This was a popular slave narrative before the Civil War, where a light-skinned Black woman and her husband escaped to slavery because she pretended to be a white man. She covered her face, and she pretended her husband was her house servant, and that she was an old white man, and they got on a train and they escaped to freedom. And so, people like me have been around forever. And for some people that's a novelty, but I mean, what I've found is that it's rarely a novelty among Black people, which is probably part of the reason I am the way I am. But I try not to make it, I don't ever want to be that to be the most important thing that people know about me. I want people to, like, to the extent that I can give that perspective and that helps people understand where I'm coming from, I think that's valuable. But I don't want that to be, I feel like I've seen too many people who try to brand themselves with a particular identity, not necessarily racial, but who try to make themselves like, I'm the person who does this. And I'm just trying to illuminate the world for my readers as best I can.
Yeah. I asked that question because I feel like I got to know you a little better in the chapter about Tamika Mallory and Louis Farrakhan. And I think sometimes as a Black community, we operate as if there's a Black orthodoxy. There's a box that Black people fit in. And then there's Black people who don't fit in that Black orthodoxy box. And if I'm thinking about another title for that chapter, or at least the way it resonated with me, was like, I had to confront the fact that sometimes I think through a lens of what the Black orthodoxy is. So someone might say that I grew up middle class in like a rich white neighborhood in Plainsboro, New Jersey, so I don't fit, right? But I went to a Black college, so that part of me fits. Or someone might say, you grew up in Washington, D.C., so you fit, but you went to a PWI, so maybe you don't fit as much as I do. And so I think that book, breaking down the Black orthodoxy, or the myth of the Black orthodoxy, would have helped me to confront some of the shortcomings, the hypocrisies of Black leaders who we have to acknowledge the tensions that we have in our own community about some of the issues that we have. And it made me do that in a way that I think I haven't done in the past. So if you could talk a little bit about that chapter, I think it would be great.
Yeah, I mean, he's talking about an essay I wrote about controversy a few years ago about the leader of the Women's March, Tamika Mallory, who, had been an anti-gun violence activist, and she had close relationships with the Nation of Islam, which, for most white Americans and for a lot of Jewish white Americans in particular, Farrakhan is just, an anti-Semite. They don't know very much about the nation's anti-violence work because they have never had occasion to encounter it. And when I was growing up in the 1990s, which was sort of the height of Farrakhan's popularity, I had to deal with this stuff because I went to a mostly Black public school in Washington, D.C. And I did not like Farrakhan at all for this reason, because I felt like people like me were invisible to him. But I also understood that the Nation of Islam as an organization was doing this work in places where the US government was simply absent, was just like unwilling and uncaring and just simply did not care. And, Tamika Mallory talked to me about, how much support the nation had given her when the father of her child had been murdered. And when she was, in communities trying to prevent gun violence, the nation was there when nobody else was there. And so that essay is really trying to explain to an outside world that does not understand Farrakhan's continued resilience, why people would continue to work with a nation in that context. And the people who condemn Farrakhan generally do not offer a helping hand to solve any of the problems that the nation is trying to solve. They are indifferent to those problems, but they say, but you're not allowed to talk to him or associate with them or deal with them. And it's understandable to me why the people who are helped by that do not listen to those critiques as a result, because it's not like the people who are saying, playing the "are you going to condemn Farrakhan" game care about those communities, specifically, not just the Black working class, but the Black underclass, people who are in prison, or who are emerging from prison, coming out of prison. These are not people that the Condemn Farrakhan caucus is ever trying to help. And for me, as someone who's Jewish, I cannot condone any of the things that he says. I find them abhorrent, but I also understand, that that's not why people are chiefly drawn to him. And until people really, I wrote that essay to help people sort of understand where Mallory was coming from, why she had taken such a hard line on the question. Like she refused to condemn Farrakhan. She said she disagreed with his statements about Jewish people and she didn't support that at all. But she didn't want to condemn the nation because the nation had been there for her when nobody else was there for her. And I was trying to explain to a world that I think simply does not understand that dynamic or how it could work or that it exists at all, because there's a lack of curiosity about divides within the Black community, to the extent that, you're talking about a lot of class, cultural, ideological divides that are opaque to most white Americans, because they, particularly when you cover politics, because Black Americans who are of varying ideological and ethnic backgrounds, West Indian, West African, African American, they tend to vote pretty strongly for Democrats. And because of that, people don't consider all of those distinctions, the sort of Black cross-class solidarity as a result of this sort of collective interest in fighting racism is like a relatively unique thing. It doesn't really exist for a lot of other, I don't think there's actually any other comparable community in the United States. But the problem is that kind of political unanimity on one question, just one question, hides the distinctions that you're talking about, these distinctions of class and culture and ideology and many other things. And I think, that I really like that you felt that essay brought out some of those contradictions and distinctions, gave people a more textured look at a world that, they generally are not paying attention to.
You mentioned like people aren't courageous enough to engage with people who are seemingly ideologically very different from them. And I'm wondering if you could talk about how the type of courage that you had, because you went to Trump rallies and stuff and we're interviewing people there. Can you talk about like what it took for you to be able to go into that space as a journalist and interview people and what that experience was like?
I mean, that's the job, you know. I mean, I've had to go into a lot of pretty, like, you know, not like war zones or anything, but I mean, into some environments where people don't really want to talk to you. But the interesting thing about the Trump supporters was, aside from the fact that, you know, as I write in that essay, these are completely what you would describe as normal people. You know what I mean? These are not the people who are showing up to like the Klan rally in Charlottesville. You know what I mean? These are teachers, they're healthcare workers, they're regular people. They were eager to explain themselves. You know what I mean? They felt as though they had been misunderstood. And I specifically went to these rallies to say, you know, how do you feel when people call Trump racist? And they'd say, oh, well, I think that's unfair. You know, he's not a politician. He's not polished. And I said, okay, well, and then I would rephrase something that he said to ask, but do you support like X discriminatory policy that he proposed? Like, do you think we should ban Muslim people? And they would say something like, they would basically say yes. So they would disagree with the superficial expression of his statement or its crudity, but then they would endorse the underlying policy that he had made that statement in favor of. And it was that moment that I sort of realized that there was this cognitive dissonance where people who, you know, these are not people who think of themselves as racist. They think of themselves as anti-racist. You know, they say things like, oh, I think Donald Trump loves everybody. And, you know, I think racism is wrong. But then they'd be like, but yeah, we should ban Muslims. Or yeah, we need to build a wall to keep the Mexicans from coming in. Or yeah, you know, they would endorse the underlying policy proposal or sentiment, but they didn't want to think of it as endorsing discrimination. So they would support a discriminatory policy, but not explicitly discriminatory language. And that's very old. I mean, like I said, that goes back to that sort of founding contradiction. And if you look at, you know, one of the examples I use in that essay is the Confederate vice president, you know, Alexander Stephens, who gives this very famous speech. He says, you know, the cornerstone of the Confederate government is that the Negro is not equal to the white man. And then, you know, a few years later, war is over, Confederacy is destroyed. He's sitting in prison and he starts writing, actually, you know, I never said that. That was fake news. The reporter got it wrong. And actually, I don't have any problem with Black people at all. And it's like, you know what I mean? I mean, there's a certain, this idea of human equality is like fundamental to the American idea, but the discriminatory application of that concept is inseparable from the application of that idea. So you have this, you know, this beautiful idea in principle, but in practice, the people who have been in charge of the American government have not truly believed it. And that's just very old. And it's a contradiction that people are always trying to reconcile. And, you know, for example, even Donald Trump, you know, he walked around saying, I'm the least racist person you will ever meet. Least racist person.
Yes.
Not
racist, like, but least racist.
Yeah, least racist person. And then he'd give a speech about dipping bullets in pig's blood to fight Al-Qaeda. You know what I mean? Like he just, and he really, I mean, in some ways, I think part of his potent hold on the Republican base was that he reflected them in all of their contradictions. And in particularly his enthusiasm for being cruel to people that they were afraid of was something, and his anger at those people was something that they felt validated by his expression of that. And they felt persecuted by people telling them that it was wrong to feel that way. And I think that emotional connection was part of what made him both unpopular nationally, but such a figure of such incredible adoration within the Republican base.
I want to tell you a story. So before everyone got on, Adam and I were talking about how we both live in San Antonio. I live on the east side of San Antonio. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but the east side is like known as the historically, you know, Black part of town. And it's interesting that most of my neighbors are Black and brown. Down the street, there's an older white gentleman, and my wife is on, so she knows what I'm talking about. There are literally, and I'm not exaggerating, there are literally 20 flags on flagpoles on his front yard. And I don't know what half the flags mean, but there's like a Confederate flag, there's a come and take it flag, there's an F Biden flag. 6 months ago, there was a flag with Donald Trump's head on Rambo's body with a bazooka. And can you talk about how the Trump's America in some ways has endured even beyond his administration?
Like I said, he made these people, the kind of people like your neighbor, he made them feel validated in their fears and hatreds. And part of the way he does that is he simply reflects what he sees on Fox News. So Fox News, they get people, they get this particular segment of the Republican base really wound up about something. And then he goes out and gives these speeches about that thing because he's watching Fox News all day. And so they hear someone who's saying, no, the things that you care about, that you're mad about, that other people say are stupid, no, those things are the most important things in the world. And I care about them and I care about you. And together, we're going to beat these people who think they're better than us. And that is just, in politics, frequently we particularly on the left, we talk a lot about economics. We talk about material explanations for things, but people's personal identities are very important to them. And you could see it with the vaccine. You know what I mean? If it's just about, material interests, you cannot explain vaccine hesitancy among Trump supporters. This thing that is going to keep them alive, they're not taking it because politically it is important for them not to take it. And so Trump really, I think that, it's a mistake to attribute it entirely to him. He is merely a tremendously effective conductor of these sentiments and ideas. But the way that he makes people feel is extremely powerful for them. And that's why you see that kind of performative, expressive desire to just be like, not simply support Trump, vote for him when he's in the ballot box, but build your identity around him. Let everybody know that you're a Trump supporter. Put the sign on the lawn, put the flag on your flagpole. All of that is really about, it is part of this sense of siege that they have cultivated, which is that, they are the true inheritors of the American tradition and they are keeping it alive, and the rest of the country is engaged in a conspiracy to destroy them.
What's interesting? You made me think about this. When Obama was running the first time, like everybody was wearing the Obama t-shirt. You remember the one that had like the red, the white, and the blue? It was like the best t-shirt in like 2007, 2008. Everybody was wearing it. But then like by the time the second term election for Obama comes up, no one's wearing that shirt anymore. Donald Trump is no longer president, but people are still wearing the shirt. They're still wearing the hat thing.
Sort of, but I think it's actually quite similar. I mean, I think in the same way that Obama embodied this like liberal optimism that America could be better than it used to be.
Yeah.
Donald Trump embodies this nostalgia to where America was better when particular people were in charge. In some ways, I think people are not as attached to Obama in the way that you're talking about, in part because you can't stop America from changing. You know what I mean? I mean, these people, you can't actually rewind the clock back to the 1950s, which is, to some extent what, Make America Great Again is about. Again, when was it great? So, I think in some ways, the idea of that America is bigger than Obama, and he was I think for a lot of people, a particularly emotional expression of it. I think people did feel a kind of optimism about the country with him in the White House, in the same, in their vision of America.
Yes, no doubt, no doubt. But my grandmother doesn't have the Obama flag waving from the front lawn like homeboy down the street. Like
it is not. And I think, part of it is that, Obama was a symbol of that, but this cult of personality that Trump has cultivated, Obama didn't really do that. I mean, he was admired and he was cool. People put his face on t-shirts and hats, but he did not demand a kind of blind loyalty where it was like, if I say the sky is pink, every Republican senator has to put out a statement saying the sky is pink.
Yeah. And
if they don't say the sky is pink, then they get a primary challenger who says, the sky is the pinkest it's ever been. And, so-and-so who keeps insisting the sky is blue is a liberal who needs to shut up and, step aside so that somebody who really supports Trump can go. I mean, there is something similar about it and also something different.
So one of the other chapters that you write about has to do with police abolition, but it's different than the total abolishment of the police. It's very particular to police unions. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that. And as I'm thinking about that question related to the last one, the Trump era is Blue Lives Matter. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking about how I've been in my own echo chamber, because for the longest, I had just been seeing Black Lives Matter over and over and over again. But when I'm driving down the street, I see the flag with the blue line way more often than I see the BLM. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
So the piece is an argument for getting rid of police unions, because my feeling is that police unions are essentially, they become organizations that are, because the labor of police is violence, they become organizations that their primary interest is in impunity for police officers who use violence. And because of the nature of the United States, where that use of violence, that unjustified use of violence is more easily defended against Black people, they have an interest in maintaining, they essentially have an interest in cultivating racism. And because, police are armed agents of the state, they're empowered with this authority to use lethal force on behalf of the public, not their own interests. And so when you have a political entity that is participating in the political process on behalf of armed agents of the state, you have a problem, because the whole idea behind a democracy is that the people with the guns don't make the rules. They are beholden to a public which tells them, under what circumstances it is appropriate for them to use force in a state-sanctioned fashion. And I think you could see the problems with police unions, not simply in the sort of advocacy for impunity way, but in their success in manipulating public sentiment, because they can withhold, they can essentially, their threat to withhold labor is a threat of violence. Or a threat to subject the people to violence. Like, if you don't give us what we want, then we're not really, they're doing this in Austin right now. They're sending people letters like, "Oh, sorry, we can't show up to your house even though you called the police because the district attorney is not prosecuting low-level drug possession." What? You know what I mean? This is a kind of political advocacy that is not supposed to exist among armed agents of the state. Now, I'm not a police abolitionist, and I'm not a police abolitionist because I'm not sure that cities are possible without police. And I don't mean that, I just mean, like, obviously there's a sort of twin origin of policing in the United States. In the South, they emerge out of slave patrols. In the North, they are largely a response to urban riots because, and sort of an attempt to keep the peace. But police exist all over the world. The fact that they originate in racist practices in the United States, particularly in the South, is a product of the kind of law that we had. The governing doctrine in the United States was white supremacy until the mid 20th century. And so who enforces that? The police. That's their obligation because they enforce the law. And we're still dealing with the lingering effects of that, and with the license that we gave law enforcement to enforce the law, and in particular enforce social inequalities, including those along racial and economic lines. So I'm not, I think that police abolitionists they've made a lot of good arguments. I understand why they're saying what they're saying, but I'm not quite convinced for that reason. It's hard for me to imagine not having some organization whose role it is to keep the peace in a place where, lots and lots and lots of people live who do not necessarily have any social connection to one another. But, policing is a fairly recent invention. I mean, professional policing is, late 19th century, early 20th century. It's really a fairly young concept. And what police abolitionists do is they generally have a more accurate historical lens, because policing is such a prominent part of our political landscape. I think it's a little like race, right? Like, race is such a strong part of our politics. It's hard to remember that race, as we understand it, is an intellectual invention that's only a few centuries old. So the presence of these things in our lives can sometimes mislead us as to their age and to their permanence. But I think in particular, however you feel about policing, whether you're a police abolitionist or you're not, I think it's easy to see the distorting political effect of police unions and their role in sort of cultivating an attitude among police that they are above the public that they're meant to serve, and they do not have to be accountable to them. And I think it's very dangerous in a democracy for there not to be democratic control over armed agents of the state.
That's definitely true. And that's one of the things that point about where the government, the people are supposed to be in charge of the people with the guns, to me was the main point of that particular chapter. And not maybe so much the unions shouldn't have as much power over the police than the people do. You mentioned earlier about Du Bois's writing on Reconstruction. I think it's the last chapter of the book, maybe the second to last chapter towards the end, where you talk about new Reconstruction. Can you talk a little bit about what that is? And I think people have hinted at new Reconstruction, maybe not use those words. Could you explain that to us a little bit from your perspective?
I mean, I think at this point, it's very hard to imagine a new reconstruction that is sweeping along the lines that would be necessary. Because part of, as we talked about earlier, we have a political system that overweights the votes of the most conservative elements of the country, which are white voters who are ideally geographically distributed to influence our political system. And during Reconstruction, Republicans, they did things like they admitted all these new empty states so that they could have more Republican states, they could have more representation in the Senate. They don't talk about that now when they're trying to oppose DC statehood or Puerto Rican statehood, but this is something that they did deliberately in order to enhance their political influence. But Reconstruction was obviously an expansive experiment in attempting to live up to the promises of the Constitution of the United States and make multiracial democracy a real thing. And what we face over the past few years is, an explicit attempt to roll back multiracial democracy, not just from Donald Trump, but from many fronts, from the Republican Party, from the Supreme Court, particularly with their gutting of the Voting Rights Act. I mean, we have a Supreme Court right now that ideologically believes that government interventions designed to remedy racial inequality are far more evil than racial inequality itself. They do not, they have essentially paved the way. What you see in Republican states right now, which is this sort of grand experiment with trying to disenfranchise Democratic constituencies. I don't think we know that it's going to work, but like Jim Crow didn't happen overnight either. It took years of experimentation for them to figure out precisely how to exclude Black people from political participation. And so we're in a situation where the feedback loop of democracy is somewhat broken because Republican politicians have figured out ways to avoid being accountable to the voters that they don't want to be accountable to. So if you look at a state like Wisconsin, it's almost impossible for the way the state legislative districts are drawn. It is almost impossible, no matter how many votes Democrats get. If you get 55% of the vote, you'll still get like 40 seats in the legislature, something like that. Because of geographic clustering, the urban-rural divide, it is very easy to minimize the impact of Democratic votes, which in Wisconsin is largely Black votes, places like Milwaukee and Madison. And so, the idea behind a new Reconstruction would be both an economic and political project aimed at rebuilding American commitment to multiracial democracy, which, I think I said this earlier in the discussion, but it's really half a century old, right? It's 1965, it's the Voting Rights Act. That's the moment at which America becomes truly a multiracial democracy. And so when you know that, you understand how fragile the experiment is, because it's not something, we talk about 1776, but really America as we understand it, as a multiracial democracy or as a democracy that has a commitment to multiracial democracy that is genuine on paper is only about half a century old. And I think with the problem is that, you can look at the fight in Congress right now over the infrastructure bill and reconciliation. The Democrats, because of geographic polarization, it's very hard for them to win a majority in the Senate. And because Republicans swept state legislatures in 2010, they were able to write the districts to their advantage. It's very hard for Democrats to maintain a large majority in the House. And what the Republicans had at the beginning of Reconstruction, was large majorities. And Democrats have razor-thin majorities. And they have razor-thin majorities, and which include a small number of moderates who can be very difficult to persuade, particularly when it comes to aggressive government intervention. So I think it's hard to envision anything on the scale. The Democrats say they haven't admitted any new states. They haven't done much in the way of structural change to alleviate the disproportionate influence that the other party's constituency has over the political process. Yeah. And what that means is that until Republicans are, and we know this, simply from history, at one point the Democratic Party was, the most powerful white supremacist institution in American life. And what changed that was that they became beholden to Black voters. And once they became beholden to Black voters to win in the North, that split the party. And it became, that sort of path towards the egalitarian New Deal liberalism that happened in the mid-20th century was the result of Black voters becoming an essential part of the Democratic Party. So we know that the only way that parties moderate is if they are beholden to diverse constituencies. Yeah. So, you can see Republicans passing discriminatory laws targeting various religious and ethnic minorities, but, you're never going to see a Democrat it's pretty typical to see a Republican politician say something like, we don't want any of you with your NPR tote bags and your lattes or whatever. You will never see a Democratic politician saying, well, we don't want any redneck votes, right? That's because even though non-college educated white men primarily vote Republican, non-college educated white men are still a substantial part of the Democratic Party's voting base.
Yeah.
They don't have most of them, but they are dependent on the ones that they have. And so, you may have a lot of, liberal atheists in Brooklyn, but you also have church ladies in South Carolina.
Yeah.
And you have to figure out a way to stitch those coalitions together. So you can't really be anti-Christianity or anti-religion. That diversity of your coalition makes you more moderate on questions of democracy. Because the Republican Party's base is so religiously, ethnically, culturally homogenous, it means that they are constantly trying to figure out ways to win power through that coalition alone and not have to be beholden to a more diverse constituency. And honestly, the only way you get out of this democracy doom loop here is if the Republican Party ultimately has to reach out to a more diverse constituency. Right. And you could do that with structural reforms, but these are not reforms that the Democratic Party in any sense appears interested in undertaking.
I'm wondering if you were going to write one more chapter to the book, or if there was one more essay you were going to include, what would that essay be?
So this is a good question. It would probably be the one I wrote on the Supreme Court, which I wrote in 2018. And I sort of hesitated about whether or not to include it in the book, but it was an essay on how during Reconstruction, part of the rollback of Reconstruction was these Republican justices on the Supreme Court. These guys who had been appointed by Lincoln and Grant, people who had fought in the Union Army. And they essentially read the 14th Amendment out of the Constitution. And the 13th, really, if you think about it, if you think about the convict lease system and the way a form of slavery was really imposed in the South, even after the end of Reconstruction. And the way that they did that was that they had this idea of liberty that was, liberty only in the abstract. So they say things like the 14th Amendment does not protect against discrimination by private actors. So, if a group of armed white men massacre a group of Black men who are organizing politically, that's not really a violation of the 14th Amendment. And so, they basically, they were responding to political will. Whites in the North had essentially soured on the Reconstruction project. The irony of this whole situation was that, Reconstruction had been a Republican project, but these Supreme Court justices, essentially read racial inequality, the amendments guaranteeing equality under the law, regardless of race, out of the Constitution. And that happened for a very long time, really until Brown, that the Supreme Court was just completely, almost, well, not completely, but it was very hostile to racial justice questions because of this. And so the essay that I wrote was basically about how the Roberts Court had basically revived this philosophy. And the way that they had done it was not by being explicitly racist, but by saying basically any effort to remedy racial inequality is unconstitutional. It's an infringement on liberty. I think you can, it was correct about some things. I think some of the big picture things, and it was wrong about some of the smaller things. But if I look back, if I wanted to include one, it would probably be that one.
What are you reading right now? We're a book club. What are some of the things that you're reading that are, keeping you thinking and in tune with what's going on in the world?
So I generally read for work, but I'm reading a number of things right now, which I hope will be of interest to your audience. I'm reading a lot about Haitian history right now. So I just finished a book called Silencing the Past by Michel Rolfe Trujillo. I think I'm mispronouncing it. My French is absolutely horrible, but he's a Haitian intellectual who writes about the construction of historical myth, and also in particular how silence can it prevents people from understanding history, how it actually happened. So in particular, he talks about how during the Haitian Revolution, for years in France, they refused to actually acknowledge that the Haitian Revolution was happening. They called it a riot. They were like, no, this is, it is not actually because Black men cannot conceive of their own liberty the way that white men can. It's not possible that they raised an army for the purpose of liberating themselves and forming a Black republic in the wealthiest colony in the Caribbean. There was this silence where where there was this absence of recognition of this possibility because of this ideological belief in Black inferiority. And this is not the only example he uses of this, but it's just a very interesting book that is not simply about the events of the Haitian Revolution and not simply about the way the Haitian Revolution was understood at the time or since, but is also just about the production of historical memory, which I think is a subject that's obviously, of particular interest to the United States at the moment, since we're arguing significantly about that kind of production. I also am in the middle, I'm almost finished with Randall Robinson's An Unbroken Agony. And Randall Robinson actually spoke at my 6th grade graduation when I was in elementary school. But he's, for those in your audience who may not know him, he was a Black American intellectual who was very close to the Aristide family in Haiti, the first democratically elected president of Haiti. He wrote a significant amount about the United States interference in Haiti, particularly negative interference. His book is significantly about how the United States had worked in the past to destabilize Haiti for the, to the benefit of Haiti's financial elite, but also the American corporate elite. And it's a pretty interesting book. So both of those I've been reading. Also, there's another book that might be of interest. I'm not technically rereading this. I'm going back and looking at what she said about Haiti, but there's a book called Abolition, the Slave's Cause by a historian named Manisha Sinha. And it's basically a history of abolition as a cause. So it begins before the founding of the United States. And really, it shows that from the beginning of the slave trade, you had African men who were protesting this particular form of racialized slavery, which, it's a long book, but it is really, really fascinating and really, really comprehensive.
Marcus Kroom, who is actually a really good friend of mine, he typed a question in the chat. Marcus, I've allowed you to speak. So if you want to go ahead and ask your question, you can do so.
I will. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. So my question is, first of all, I just want to say thanks for your work. It's really been a really interesting conversation. Thrilled to be able to connect with you here. So what would you expect from a Harris versus Trump election? And in particular, how do you read this kind of a contest based on U.S. history and your own reporting?
I think to the extent that right-wing politics in America has a multiracial future, it is by exploiting male insecurity around gender, or specifically the politics and masculinity. Male insecurity around gender is actually too pat, because I think traditional masculinity is an idea that appeals to women as well as men, not just men. But I think perhaps an underrated factor in Trump's appeal is his projection of a particular style of masculinity in which he does what he wants without consequences. I think that appealed to a lot of people. One of the stories that I wrote a few years ago was about men's rights activists, and you can find the story online. It's at BuzzFeed. But I think there is a significant audience out there for kind of right-wing politics of masculinity, and I think it probably crosses race, gender, and class lines. And so I would expect, and I don't want to make any predictions because I'm not very good at political prognostication. I suspect that a race like that would be similarly gendered in its politics as the one between Trump and Hillary, with some obviously the added political dynamic of Kamala Harris being Black and Asian. But she is, I would say that a lot of Asian Americans claim her, but I think that white Americans largely see her as Black. And I want to make a distinction because I'm not saying she is not Asian. She is our first Asian and first Black American vice president and first woman vice president. But I think white people primarily see her as Black, and also, like Obama, want to deny her Blackness. It was, the lawyer who wrote the memo saying that Mike Pence could personally overturn the election on Trump's behalf. He had previously written a story saying Kamala Harris was ineligible for the vice presidency based on where she was born. So I mean, there's I would expect that a race like that to be extremely ugly in both gendered and racial terms. I cannot tell you who would prevail under that circumstance, but I think it would be inevitable. Those would be the fault lines that it would be.
So Roger Booker has a question in the Q&A, and I'm gonna modify it just a little bit. Your book, The Cruelty is the Point, comes out at a time where there's much talk about critical race theory in school. And so what do you think about the whole critical race theory debate? And how do you think that, just in terms of how your work may have influence on the culture and what it represents in terms of people's misconceptions of maybe what critical race theory is?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think this is a battle over historical memory. It's really a battle over, you know, I mean, what kids are being taught in school is not critical race theory. I mean, that's a college level discipline. To the extent that they are being taught things that are influenced by critical race theory, they are being taught that the legacy of American racial discrimination still matters in the present. And if you are someone who opposes any state intervention to alleviate racial inequality in the present, then you want to undermine any kind of scholarship or any kind of teaching that would suggest that there is an obligation that Americans have to remedy those inequalities. And so you do not want to teach any version of history that, in my view, resembles reality, because then you might be teaching children that they have that obligation and that it's an obligation they should fulfill as adults. I think that's unquestionably what it's about. I don't think it's about necessarily the whatever criticisms of critical race theory that Skip Gates and Randall Kennedy have. That's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about an effort to prevent the teaching of anything other than American historical innocence. And you know, that is primarily about politics in the present.
So Adam, I want to thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And I hope your audience enjoyed the conversation.